In this tutorial, we're going to animate UI components in a NativeScript Angular 2 application. So if you've been following along, I already did make a video tutorial on animations, but the previous tutorial was on animating with CSS keyframes. The difference here in this tutorial is we're actually going to be animating with the Angular 2 animation components. So these are actual components that are baked into Angular. So it's just an alternative way to animate in a NativeScript application. I think it's more of a preference than anything. The APIs are a bit different, and you'll see. So I definitely recommend watching the other video as well if you haven't already. So to make things easy to understand, we're gonna create a fresh project. I'm gonna create it on my desktop. So I'm gonna say TNS create my project, and I'm gonna give it the Angular 2 attribute, so NG. So you'll notice that I do have an iOS simulator up on my machine. This tutorial will work for Android and iOS. So if you would prefer Android, or maybe you're not using a Mac and you want to do Android, that's perfectly fine. And for reference, I am using version 2.3.1 of NativeScript, although things should remain pretty much the same in future versions now that Angular 2 is stable release. So I did create the project. I'm going to navigate into it. I'm going to clear, and then I'm going to add the iOS build platform. TNS platform add iOS. And you would just change that to Android if you preferred that as well. So I'm going to clear it, and I'm going to open up the project in my editor of choice. Now you can open it up in any editor that you want. Mine will be Atom by GitHub. So unlike the previous tutorial, we're not going to really worry about the CSS file. In fact, I'm actually going to clear it, and for now we're just going to leave it as is. We'll be spending all of our time in the app component.html file and the app component.ts file because this is Angular 2. We're not really doing CSS animations in this particular tutorial. So in order to make the animations work for Angular 2, we need to import a few more dependencies. So we have component, we'll leave that there. All of these are coming from Angular core. So we're going to include trigger, we're going to include state, transition, animate, and style. And then go ahead and save it. I am going to go back to my app.component.html file. We're going to clear out everything within the stack layout. I'm not going to remove the stack layout itself. Instead, I'm going to add a button. And we're going to say, this is a button. Doesn't have to be anything special. That's outside of the scope on what we're trying to do. I'll keep it capital just to be consistent. All right. So we're going to be animating this button. So going back into the app.component.ts file, let's go ahead and add some things. Everything that we add will be inside of the component block. So on a new line, go ahead and say animations, and this is going to be an array because you could have many different animations here. So the first animation, we're going to say trigger, and we're going to say state, and we're going to have an array. So this is the stuff that happens inside of the trigger state. Oh, the state trigger, I'm sorry. All right, so for this, we have a few things. We have state, and we're going to have inactive state. And this really doesn't have anything to do with what we've named it. State is an actual function. So if I were to change this to something else, this would still be state. They're not dependent on each other. So in the inactive state, I'm going to say style. So we're going to assign it a style. And I'm going to assign it a background color. And the background color, we're going to say it's red. So something very simple. And we're going to change it up after this as well. So I'm going to do comma. I'm going to say state active. So that was the inactive state, what it should start at. And now what happens when this animation starts? So what should it do? So we're going to say style. We're going to say background color. This time we're going to say, let's go ahead and say green. All right, so we have our two states. Now we need to figure out what happens during the transition between these two states. So we need to define two transition properties, or transition functions or methods, whatever you want to call them. So in the inactive to active, so when we're going from inactive to active, we want to say animate, and we want to say we're going to animate for 600 milliseconds. We're going to ease out in the transition. So that's one transition state. And then our other transition state will be active to inactive. And the animate will be the same. It's going to be 600 millisecond animation, and it's going to ease out. All right, so we have the foundation to our animations laid out for this button. We have one animation here. This one animation, it's called state. It has an inactive and active. There's a few other types of states that it can have. We're not going to focus on those here. I definitely recommend checking out the Angular 2 documentation. But we also have transition effects for what happens when we change the states. So let's go ahead. We need to add a few variables here in order to further make the success. So we're going to remove what's inside of this app component. It will not be used for this particular tutorial. Inside of this, we want to say public current, and this is going to be a Boolean. This is going to represent our current state. We want to have our constructor, and this is where we define our current state. So we're going to say this.current equals false. So again, we're doing true and false here, but we're doing inactive, active here. It could be whatever you want. You can match them up. We're going to map them in the front end actually, and I'll show you the two versions. So let's say toggle as our other function. So we're going to say this.current equals the inverse of whatever current is set to. So it'll allow us to toggle it between true and false, rather than if I were to make this a string, I would have to do things. I would have to add some if statements in there. It could potentially get a little messy. So I'm going to save it. We're going to go back to our app component.html, and we're going to make some changes here. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave the text, but what we need to add is we need to add reference to our state. So this state right here is actually what we called it. We called the trigger state. And if we were to call it something else, that's what that name would reflect. So for the state, now we're going to do some logic here to figure out whether or not we're active or inactive. So we're going to say current, and this is going to be a ternary operation. If it's true, we're going to say it's active. Otherwise, we're going to say it's inactive. And this active, inactive represents inside of our app.component these two states. And the at state represents our attribute tag right here. All right, so one more thing to add. We need to add that tap event. So let me, I'll drop this down, clean it up a little bit. So the tap event, we need to say toggle. Perfect. So at this time, we should be able to run it, and there shouldn't be any errors at this point. So I'm going to open up my terminal here, as well as my simulator, and I'm going to say TNS emulate iOS. So you can see the button is red. So if we go back to our code, we have inactive. The background color is red. So that matches up correctly. So if I click it, it's going to transition over a span of 600 milliseconds to green. And I can go back and forth. and it's smooth like butter. So actually, what happens if we increase this to 1,000? We could easily say 1 second as well. But let's go ahead and rerun it. And I could easily do live sync as well. It's just forgot to do that. All right, so I'll click it again. And you can see that it was a much slower transition this time versus the previous, because now it's 400 milliseconds slower. So there's other things that we can do. Pretty much most of the same stuff that you could have done with the CSS keyframe. So for example, let's go ahead and try something. Let's go ahead and say we're going to set the scale. This should work. Transform. And we're going to say scale. Let's say 1, 1. And let's go ahead and say, again, this is assuming I remember my CSS stuff. Scale 2, 2. Let's see what that does, if anything. It may not do anything. All right, if I click it, what happens? So it did expand. So now we have more effects. So we have the colors changing, we have the scale changing, and you can see that this stuff, as minor as it is, it really makes a difference in your application and your user experience. So this, again, just to reiterate, we actually did use Angular 2 animations for this particular tutorial. Previously, in another tutorial I made on YouTube, we did CSS keyframe animations. Those are just two different ways to solve a problem, and I definitely recommend you checking out both of them because they are pretty cool.